Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into something that's absolutely crucial, yet surprisingly misunderstood when it comes to India's agricultural economy. As someone who studies the oilseeds economy of India closely, I want us to take our time today and really unpack this. We're going to do a detailed, comprehensive sectoral overview of the massive structural crisis going on right now. We'll be looking at the ballooning oilseeds import crisis, the root causes, the deep-seated constraints holding the sector back, and, most importantly, what can actually be done to fix it. This isn't just some abstract macroeconomic theory. This is an issue that dictates the cost of basic kitchen essentials for over 1 billion people. It's a fascinating, almost contradictory story of how a true agricultural powerhouse can somehow find itself completely dependent on the rest of the world for everyday cooking oil. Okay, let's dive into this. Consider this staggering number for a second. 1.75 trillion rupees. That's trillion with a T. That is the estimated edible oil import bill for India in the current oil year. It's literally a colossal drain on foreign exchange, and it exposes the entire country to imported food inflation, currency depreciation, and just massive supply chain vulnerabilities. But to really understand why India is spending over 1.5 lakh crore rupees buying cooking oil from global markets, we have to first understand the sheer scale of domestic consumption. So why the huge bill? Well, the underlying driver here is a massive, unprecedented surge in demand. India is home to over 1.4 billion people, and dietary habits are shifting fast. Over the last 2 decades alone, per capita edible oil consumption has roughly doubled. We're talking about going from just under 10 kilograms per person to over 20 kilograms. And when you multiply that seemingly small per-person increase by 1.4 billion people, it creates an aggregate demand so enormous that domestic agriculture is basically just scrambling to keep up. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the edible oil import crisis, move into the great production paradox, look at how demand outpaces domestic supply, explore why oilseeds fall behind, examine the processing and policy gap, and finally, wrap up with strategies for strategic self-reliance. Let's start with Section 1, the edible oil import crisis, and really understanding the magnitude of the problem. Right now, India is the world's largest edible oil import market. To feed the population, the country relies on a highly concentrated group of global suppliers. We're talking palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia, soybean oil from South America, and sunflower oil from the Black Sea region. And the vulnerability here is stark. Over 56% of India's edible oil consumption comes from foreign imports. That means domestic production is meeting less than 44% of the demand. To put that in perspective, for more than half of a daily mass-consumed essential commodity, India is entirely exposed to global geopolitical conflicts, shipping bottlenecks, export bans, and international biodiesel mandates. It's a huge strategic vulnerability. Which brings us to Section 2, the Great Production Paradox. We're growing more seeds, but still importing more? Now, what's really interesting about this is you might naturally assume that India just isn't growing enough oilseeds, or that farming is stagnant. It's super easy to assume domestic production is failing, but the data tells a completely different story. Between the 2014-15 and 2024-25 seasons, India's oilseed production actually jumped by nearly 55%. Productivity per hectare improved by about 31%. Farmers are growing more groundnut, more mustard, and more soybean, and yet the import bill just keeps ballooning. So how on earth can domestic production grow so significantly while the country stays totally hooked on imports? Let's look at Section 3 for the answer. Demand outpaces domestic supply, driven by the changing Indian diet. The answer to our paradox isn't a failure in farming. It's that domestic demand has absolutely exploded, swallowing up those hard-won production gains whole. The Indian diet is undergoing a radical transformation. With rising incomes and rapid urbanization, people aren't just using more visible cooking oil at home. They are consuming massive amounts of invisible oil. This is the oil hidden in convenience foods, bakery items, and packaged snacks. The processed food industry relies heavily on imported palm oil because it's cheap, stable for frying, and semi-solid at room temperature. Plus, we can't ignore the livestock link. Crushing oilseeds gives us oil, sure, but it also gives us protein-rich oil cake, which is absolutely non-negotiable for dairy and poultry feed. As India consumes way more milk, eggs, and meat, the demand for this protein meal skyrockets, driving a huge parallel demand for oilseeds that local farms just can't fulfill on their own. Moving on to Section 4, why oilseeds fall behind. Let's break down the structural and policy constraints. So if demand is off the charts, why don't Indian farmers just plant more oilseeds and cash in? Well, the reality is rooted in a severe historical policy bias towards cereals. For decades, crops like rice and wheat have basically been treated as VIPs. They get assured procurement by the government, hefty subsidies for power and irrigation, and naturally they take up the most premium fertile land. Oilseeds, on the other hand, are kind of treated like stepchildren. They face huge price risks, very weak or episodic government procurement, and they were routinely pushed onto much less fertile, marginal lands. Everyone talks about crop diversification, but the actual economic incentives strongly favor cereals every single time. Because oilseeds are constantly pushed to these marginal lands, a staggering 76% of India's oilseed area is entirely rain-fed. Let that sink in. 3/4 of the crop is completely at the mercy of the monsoon. The plants often suffer from moisture stress, right when they need water the most, during flowering and pod filling. They're highly vulnerable to droughts, unseasonal rain, you name it. And because the risk of crop failure is so incredibly high, farmers are naturally pretty hesitant to spend money on expensive, high-quality seeds or vital fertilizers. It basically traps the entire sector in a persistent cycle of low productivity. Let's shift gears to Section 5, the processing and policy gap, taking us from the seeds in the ground to the actual oil in the kitchen. The bottlenecks don't just stop at the farm gate. We really need a paradigm shift here. We have to stop looking just at the sheer weight of the crop harvested and start looking at the actual recoverable oil. So the crucial point is this: breeding for seed tonnage isn't enough. The real goal has to be recoverable edible oil per hectare. For instance, a crop like soybean yields a massive tonnage of seeds and valuable protein meal, but its actual oil content is pretty low, only around 18 to 20%. Meanwhile, mustard or groundnut pack a much higher oil content, often over 40%. If policies only reward the sheer physical weight of the harvest, we completely miss the main objective, which is securing usable cooking oil. Furthermore, we've got a massive and, frankly quite ironic, capacity paradox in the processing sector. India actually has plenty of crushing and refining infrastructure, but the capacity utilization is abysmally low. It's sitting at only around 30%. Many of the domestic solvent extraction plants located out in the rural areas are using outdated tech and dealing with totally unpredictable seed supplies. Meanwhile, you have these massive state-of-the-art refineries sitting near the coastlines and major ports. They're perfectly positioned to process imported raw crude oil rather than domestically grown seeds. So domestic processing infrastructure essentially rusts away while the import bills keep climbing. This leads us straight into the deeply conflicting policy priorities of the government, which is constantly trying to juggle competing national interests. When global oil prices spike, the government frequently slashes import tariffs to keep cooking oil cheap for everyday consumers. But here's the catch. This sudden flood of cheap imports usually hits exactly when the Indian farmer is harvesting their own crop, crashing domestic prices and hurting the farmer's income. Additionally, the national push for green energy and biofuels creates another layer of tension. Strong incentives for ethanol feedstocks, like maize, can actually end up diverting valuable agricultural land straight away from the food oil crops the country desperately needs. Which brings us to the final part, Section 6, Strategies for Strategic Self-Reliance and Fixing this System Coordination Failure. Let's move to and see how this builds into a cohesive, three-part strategy to actually fix this complex web of challenges. First, we need horizontal expansion. Since creating new farmland is tough, we absolutely have to utilize rice fallows, planting short-duration oilseeds using the leftover soil moisture right after the rice harvest, and aggressively promote intercropping. Second, vertical expansion. We have to bridge that massive yield gap by giving farmers high oil content seeds and, critically, delivering protective irrigation at the right times. And third, value chain expansion. This means modernizing those crushing plants we talked about and directly linking farmer-producer organizations, or FPOs, to these processors so the farmers finally get a fair and reliable price. On the policy side, physical expansion isn't enough. We need critical interventions. The government needs to implement predictable, variable import tariffs. Think of it as a dynamic price band that protects consumers from price spikes, but still guarantees a solid price floor for domestic farmers during harvest. We also need strict procurement parity with cereals to give farmers the financial security to actually diversify. We've got to modernize extraction plants with targeted subsidies. And this is a big one. We need to fully exploit secondary sources, recovering oil from rice bran and cottonseed. That's a huge win because it doesn't require planting a single extra acre. Lastly, from a public health angle, promoting optimal dietary moderation is key to slowing down this exponential demand for highly processed oils. To wrap up this entire sectoral overview, there's a powerful quote from the source material that really hits the nail on the head. It says, "India faces a system coordination failure across research to seed, to farm incentives, to procurement, to processing, to trade and consumption.
This crisis isn't just about a lack of good seeds or a few bad monsoons. It is a deeply entrenched political economy problem. If you look back at the famous Yellow Revolution of the early 1990s, it succeeded precisely because it coordinated all these moving parts beautifully. To do that again today, India has to stop treating these components in isolation and start managing the whole life cycle, from the research lab all the way to the kitchen table, as one holistic, interconnected system.
Which leaves us with a really profound, forward-looking question to think about. As the whole world races toward green energy, can India achieve strategic edible oil self-reliance while simultaneously balancing the massive, land-hungry demand for biofuels and energy security? This complex tug of war between food and fuel is honestly just beginning, and how India navigates this delicate balance is going to fundamentally shape its agricultural and economic future for decades. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive explainer of India's oilseeds economy.